Today we're going to talk about a fascinating 10-year period in the history of Canada, and the subject is On the King's Daughters Are the Mothers of New France. Back in 1662, what we now know as Canada was owned by the French, although there were Indians there years before. Somebody came and planted a flag and said, "We claim all this land for the King of France." And so it became called New France. And in 1662, when we start, this is what North America looked like. New France is the blue territory that you see on the map. And you can see it's quite extensive. It runs all the way from Nova Scotia, or Acadia, over here, all the way over to the Great Lakes, down to St. Louis, where the French had a little fort, and all the way up here almost to Hudson's Bay. Now, to the south, along the Atlantic Ocean, was the British colonies. And the British, of course, were eager to do westward expansion, and they were getting blocked by the French, who were coming down here in the Ohio Valley. So the French were concerned about this, and beyond this, New France, although it was a vast territory, only had about 3,000 settlers in the whole area. And about 2,500 of them were right here between a little bit east of Quebec down to Montreal, right in this circle right here. And there were another 400 or so in here in Acadia, in what is now Nova Scotia. Meanwhile, the British colonies down here had 80,000 people in it at this time. They had grown much faster. And the main reason they had grown faster was that they brought families in to settle. Whereas the French, the king had given a monopoly to a company. Actually, it was given back in early times, around 1626, to a company called the Company of 100, which were a group of merchants mainly in the Paris area, but also in La Rochelle and in Brittany. And they were supposed to bring settlers into New France. However, they ignored this part of their contract and mainly brought unmarried men to work in the company, mainly to supply France with the beaver skins, which were very important for the beaver hats, which were of big fashion in Europe at the time. And so something had to be done. In 1662, Louis XIV, who had been king since he was 5 years old, suddenly decided he was going to take over the country. He was now in his early 20s. And his mother had been acting as regent for all this time since he became king. And he decided, now's the time that I need to do something about my colonies. And so he got together, he appointed a minister named Colbert, who we'll meet in a little while. But they came up with a plan, because New France had been having problems with the Iroquois Indians who were coming up the Richelieu River and Lake Champlain and then up to the St. Lawrence River, and they've been attacking the little villages along the St. Lawrence. And so he decided he would do several things to grow the colony. First, he decided to give them some semblance of order, so he appointed a new governor and an intendant, and the intendant was in charge of civil affairs in the community. He was more or less the head of the state from the standpoint of running the courts and all of these type of things, whereas the governor was largely a person who was in charge of ceremony and also the military, because he was always picked from the Marines for all of the colonies that were outside of France, because they're all overseas. And then he decided he would send a regiment of soldiers over, actually 1,200 strong, to fight the Iroquois and get that problem off of their backs. And finally, they realized that New France would never grow unless they brought in some women of marriageable age, because single men outnumbered single women 10-1. And so it wasn't growing. And so the king said, and Colbert said, let us get a program to send women of marriageable age over to New France. And so they offered to any young women who were not married free passage to Quebec and Montreal if they would marry over there. And once they married, they would get a dowry of 50 pounds, 50 livres in France. So this was a big incentive to girls to come over, because in France, generally, it was the fathers that decided who the girls would marry, and they had no say in the matter. So that was one incentive. So that was 1662. By late 1662, so it's too late to send anybody over. So, and they hadn't got a plan in place yet, which was pretty hard. So they decided that they would ask the intendant of La Rochelle, which is located on the west coast in France, and asked him to recruit girls to leave from that port to go to Quebec. So, and so in 1663, the intendant there, with help from some of his agents, recruited people from that area, from the western part of France mostly. Although there were a couple of girls that came in from Paris and even from Orleans and a few other places quite far away. So that first year, the French port of La Rochelle became the first port of departure from France for the first group of girls. And there were 36 girls that were recruited, actually 37. But the 37th one, when she got to Quebec, was captured by the Iroquois and carted away. And no one knows what happened to her. We don't even know her name now. But this is the port they left from. Now, the port of La Rochelle was largely a Protestant area. And Cardinal Richelieu, back 30 years before, had declared Canada is going to be a Catholic country. And so when the girls arrived, and there were, I forget but there were how many there were, but there were probably 6 or so that were Protestant. And so first thing they did was try to make them abjure the Calvinist religion and become Catholic, which I think they all did. Whether or not they really became Catholics or not, who knows? But anyhow, they became Catholic because of pressure put on them. And but now this here is Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the minister in charge of the filles des rois. That's in French. The filles des rois are the king's daughters. And and he was in charge of the program. And so in 1664, he said we should move most of the program over to the Paris and North area, because that first year, the girls were sent in king ships. That means they were sent in Navy ships over to Quebec. And so they gave the recruitment became a part of the company. The new company that the governor had set up, and they were headquartered in Dieppe, which is on the North Shore in north of Paris. And so they decided that the whole operation would go from the western part of the country to Paris and north. And so they did a couple of things. The king asked the Archbishop of Rouen, which is on the north coast, and he was the Archbishop of that large area of Normandy area and over into Picardy in that area. And he asked him to ask his priest in each parish to try to find 2 girls that would volunteer to go to Canada. Now, the other thing they were looking for a way to get a large group of girls. And so they went to the Hotel de Paris, which was not a hospital as such, but it was more of a place for poor people and children. Most of them were taken in as very young girls. Well, they were taken in both as boys and girls, but we're looking at the female section of that Paris. There was also a section where they swept the streets of prostitutes, and they were put in a different in the women's section, but in a different part from the young girls, mainly waifs that they took from their parents sometimes right on the street, and there were nuns that brought them up, and they had a pretty hard life there, and they didn't have much chance to have a good life after they grew up and were able to leave the place. So they decided to use that as a principal place to recruit girls. And so they talked to the administrators of that women's section, which was called the Salpêtrière, because it had been a munitions depot before it became a hospital. But anyhow, this became the main. About 1/3 of all of the women that went in this 10-year period came from that institution. And the girls were, well, what happened was, in some of the early people that went over, they found they had some problems. Because there was at least one woman who was trying to escape a bad marriage, and she went on the thing, and when she got to Quebec, somebody recognized her as somebody who was married back in France. And so they shipped her back. And there were also a couple of girls that decided they went over mainly to ply the streets of Quebec for their own trade. And so they were shipped back also. And so from that date on, each girl who went had to have a certificate from either their priest or the town's magistrate, claiming that they were free to marry and that they were of good character. And so from probably about 1666 on, that they had to do that. The girls at the hospital in Paris were recruited mainly by the nuns there, who kind of picked out the ones that they thought should go. And they were anywhere from 12 years old to 18 or 20. And so they had to be looked at by a doctor to make sure they were in good health. And then they were taken into a room and they were told about the program and told it was voluntary, but it was kind of voluntary with pressure. But most of the girls went voluntarily because they had without a dowry and without any knowledge of what was going to happen to them when they were able to leave the place. They were taught some skills, but very little. And so they felt it was easier for them to go to the king's new wilderness colony than where they could pick a husband, because this was very important to them. They didn't have to take the first man that was thrown at them. They had a choice. They could say no. So this was a big deal. So they recruited, and over that 10-year period, there were over 800 girls that were recruited to go on the program. Now, the other place that they got people was the Church of the Sulpicians, St. Sulpice, because the Sulpicians were in charge of Montreal at that time. They were asked to come in and take over Montreal because they needed somebody to run that outpost in Canada. And so that church was actively recruiting girls to go over there. And so that was another place where they got girls. And most of the other girls came from Normandy and the northern part of the area, and because they were all had to head to Dieppe to get the boats. Now, after the recruitment took place, however, each year, the boats left generally sometime between Easter and into May, the end of May, because that was the period, because it took 2 to 3 months for the boats to get across the ocean at that time. So they had a long journey ahead of them. But first they had to get to the port. And from Paris, it was between 1 and 2 week journey, mostly by foot because there was no other means, except I found out just recently that some of them actually went by a barge up the Seine, which could go part way up to Dieppe. But then they had to get off the barge and walk the rest of the way. And so arrangements had to be made mainly through the parish priests that were in the villages they were going through to take care of them at night, to find a place for them, either with some of his parishioners who agreed to take some of the girls for overnight, or else they would sleep on the pews in the church or on the floor, because a lot of the churches didn't have pews. They just had everybody stood for Mass. And they also had to arrange for the food for them on the journey. So this was their first ordeal, was to get to the port. Once they got to the port, you got to realize that there was no such things as passenger ships. There were merchant vessels, or there were war vessels, and that was all that they had to go on. So the company that was in charge of sending them to Quebec met them at the port, and they were all given cases, a case with things they would need when they got to Quebec. And in the cases, they'd have a couple of pair of stockings, handkerchief, a bonnet, and a coif, and they had 100 needles and 1,000 pins, straight pins, because they would have to do their own sewing, and comb, a knife, and scissors. And there were a few other things too, but that was the essentials that was in the case for them to take with them. Yes?
Were they allowed to have guardians or protection along the way? So,
yes. The question is, were they allowed to have guardians or something for protection along the way? In the first early years, they didn't have this, and they really found out that they had to have this. So they had a guardian that met them in Paris and went with them. And this was an older woman, an older married woman, and so that was the guardian that they had that went with them on the journey, and she walked with them, and she it was the same woman for about. There were two women actually that did it, went over with them, came back, and there were a couple of women whose husband had died. They were in Quebec, or the Quebec area, and were quite prominent women there, and their husband had died, so they volunteered to go over to France and bring a group back. The other person that did some recruiting was Madame Burgess, and she became a nun who started the order in Montreal. And so she went over and brought girls back twice. And so, this was mainly the girls that left from 66 on. Before that, they were kind of on their own. And then the girls that were recruited up in Normandy from the parishes up there, they walked from their houses or villages to Dieppe to meet the boat. Now, the ships at that time, here's a quick map of France, and you see that La Rochelle is here on the west coast, right there, and Dieppe is up here on the English Channel. And Paris is here. Whoops. Well, okay, we went fast there, but this is what the ships look like that they would go on. And generally the ships at this time were about 70 to 100 feet long and about 30 feet wide at their widest. And the passengers all were put in the hold. The hold is below the deck, and in this space, each girl or each passenger, because there were more than just the girls going, and there could be anywhere up to 200 people on a voyage going over, if you can imagine that. They were given a very thin mattress made of some kind of material like burlap, filled with straw, and they were very narrow, and they took these on board and they laid them in lines on board, and that's what they had, with little space between them for what they brought with them. And the arrangement was that the front of the hold would have the material that was going over, would have their barrels of water and barrels of lard and other goods that they would have for eating on the trip, mainly hardtack. Hardtack was the main food. You know, everybody know what hardtack is. Hardtack is a very hard biscuit, which was the type of thing that they used on the early vessels, and these were actually the king had bakeries at the ports to bake these things for all the voyages. And of course the flour was sometimes contaminated, and most times, as they were going on the voyage, and they'd find out that there were weevils and maggots in them, and they'd bang them on the floor to knock them out. So this was the main food. They had kind of a gruel sometimes for breakfast, but the food wasn't very great. Now, and they also had live animals, and they were up in the front of the hold. And the live animals were like chickens and pig and a cow, and these were used to slaughter during the trip for the captain's table, because the captain took all of the nobles that were on the voyage, invited them to dinner every night, and they had real food. And then behind all of these things, then the single men would go next, and they would be put in the next part of the hold. Behind them were the married families. They were behind that, and the single girls, were at the very back of the hold. Now, some of the bigger ships had rudimentary cabins. What these were along the sides of the ship. They had a plank, and there was a curtain that came down to cover it, and that would be for religious, nuns, priests, and for nobility. That's where they would sleep, but they would have a little covering over them. and so that was how they were set. Now, they would take off from there and head out to sea from Dieppe, which is here, and come out, and actually our lines are straight lines, and of course they didn't go in straight lines, but we couldn't do it differently. And then they came down along the coast of Portugal and headed out. Now, why did they do this instead of going right across like this? Well, because the ocean currents came up here along this coast and went across like that. And so if they went the shortest way, they would be going against the currents, and it would take much longer to go what looks like the shortest way. And so they would go south until they got the currents that went westward. And so they'd come down here, and they'd get down. Sometimes they would head for the Azores, and that would be a first stop where they would get on new supplies. And sometimes they'd even go further south to Madeira or the Canary Islands, and then go across, because the winds were westerly, and that was the best. That's what they were looking for. However, it still took at least 2 months, and a lot of the voyages took 3 months, because they were dependent upon the winds and to get there. Now, also, they were bound to hit bad weather, and they all did. And if they had bad weather, which they did, they would have to close all the holes in the ship, and to block out the rain and the waves that would be bouncing onto the deck. And so and it would also cut out the light. The only light they had was these smoky lanterns in there, and when everything was closed up, the whole place became smoky and smelly from that, plus the smell of up to 200 people, and the slop buckets, because that was all that they had was pails, which to use, and And then you have the smell of the live animals. And so you can imagine what it was like in there. And then if they were in a bad storm with the rolling seas, there would be seasickness, and there would be the smells of vomit. And if anybody came down with a communicable disease, it would just go through the ship like crazy. And so you can imagine spending 3 months in something like this. Now, the other thing was that the average number of people that died on these ships was at least 10%. So they had funerals at sea, so they were having a ceremony and tossing the bodies overseas into the water. So if a boat arrived in Quebec and there were only 2 or 3 people that died, there'd be much rejoicing. They'd think this was a wonderful event. So of the 800 and something girls that went, we've only been able to really define 763 that made it to Canada. Now, on good days, they would allow the girls up on the deck for short periods of time in small groups. They couldn't let everybody up. The people who were in the hold could come up in small groups for a half an hour to walk around. So they would get some air once in a while. Of course, the other thing was that because they didn't have any fresh vegetables, scurvy was common too. By the time they got to the port, some of them were already suffering from scurvy, had lost teeth, and were getting some of the problems from that. Now, as they finally approach land, and usually the first place that these ships landed was in Newfoundland. There was a French fishing village right about there, and they would stop there to take on fresh water. This was the other problem they had. The water usually went bad after some weeks because maybe the barrels had been used for something else before they filled them with water or some other reason. And also sanitation was bad because the people on board would dip everybody was given a little bowl or something, everything, that was their bowl, and they would dip it in the water, and everybody else was dipping it into the water. So, and of course there was no showers, so they didn't bathe. So there were 3 months at sea, 200 people jammed together. You can imagine how they all smelled when they arrived. But that first stop of land was usually here. All the ships didn't stop there, but they would stop there, and a couple of the girls would say, "I want to get off," and so 2 or 3 of them would be let off there, and they would find husbands there in this little port. So, and then the ships would go on. They'd still have a long way to go because they had to get from there into the bay and then down the St. Lawrence River. The next stop was Tadoussac. Tadoussac was really, it was, they called them, was a place where they would bring the furs to be shipped back to France. And so it was a port that did that. And they'd stop there because the river narrowed a little bit beyond then, and they had to bring on a pilot from Quebec to take the ship down the rest of the way. So this was the first sight that the girls got of this big city they were going to, the capital of New France. And actually, there was probably a few more places in here. You can see most of the houses are down here along the river. And and most of the tradesmen and business places and houses were down here. Up on the upper town is the some of the major churches. The Jesuits were up here. This was the hospital, the Hotel Dieu, and here's the Ursuline convent was right here. And this was the, well, you've heard of the Chateau Frontenac? This was the Chateau Frontenac because the governor was named Frontenac. But it wasn't anywhere like the present-day Chateau Frontenac. But this is where the soldiers were housed, and a lot of the single guys lived. So the boat landed here at a so-called, see here's one here that's in there, are just coming in. And the girls unloaded, and when they got off the ship, which straightened out as best as they could, they were greeted by some of the dignitaries of Quebec, and they were marched up to the top of the hill to where the Ursuline convent was, because there was a small house on their grounds, and that was where they were going to stay, most of them. About 18% were being shipped off to Three Rivers and Montreal, and just a few to Three Rivers and the rest to Montreal. But this is generally what the filles de roi were dressed in. And those were the type of caps that they were given in the case. And I'm sure that the girls didn't look quite like this after 3 months in a hold of a ship. But they got off the ship, and this is the 350th anniversary of the first ship that came into Quebec. And they are going to redo that this year. On August 7th, they've got a tall ship that's going to come in with 36 girls that were picked to represent that first shipload of girls that came in. And they're going to actually, the tall ship is going to bring those 36 girls into port, and they're going to depart from the ship, and they're going to walk up to the Ursuline convent on August 7th in the morning. And so I hope to be there, but whether I'll get there or not, who knows. Anyhow, so once they got settled in there, the other girls that were going on went back down to the harbor again after maybe a day or two of rest there, a couple of days, and they were shipped off to down up the river to Montreal. Now, the girls that went to Montreal probably had a little better than the girls here, because Mother Burgess had actually bought this house. It wasn't quite this big at the time, but this is still a museum there in Quebec, and it's where the girls were stayed until they married. And so they were, and Mother Burgess ran a school for them, and it was a school that taught them how to sew, how to make clothes, how to cook, how to take care of the farm, because most of them were going to go to farmers, and so they had to learn all these things. And in fact, this is the oldest home economics school in North America. Yeah. So you can imagine what it was like. But they were housed here, and the suitors actually came to the house to meet them. And so the students would knock on the door and come in, and they generally come alone or with maybe a couple of them. And then the girls, they'd assign some of the girls to go down and meet with them, and they'd talk a while and decide if they really wanted to do it. And so if they made a commitment, they could have make a commitment right there, and they didn't have to marry right away. And the girl could say no. She'd ask him questions. Do you have a house? Have you got provisions for the winter that's coming up? Because by the time they landed, it was early fall. and how much land do you have cleared? Because it was all forest, and so once they were given land, they had to clear it. And so this was a big deal, that they wouldn't be living in a tent. And this is one of the reasons that the men didn't get married right away, because they had to get some kind of a shelter for themselves and for whoever they were going to marry, and for their family to be. And these houses were mainly, a lot of them were made of stone with masonry. Some were wood, but they were generally one room with a big fireplace. The fireplace was where they cooked, and the living area and the bedroom were all in that one space. And then when the kids came, there was a loft up above where there were tall rafters because of all the snow up there. They couldn't have flat roofs. And so there was a loft up above with a ladder, and that's where the kids slept, and where all the smoke went into. So it's amazing that they weren't all suffocated. Anyhow, now, one of the reasons the king decided to bring the girls over was because he was sending these 1,200 troops over. And these were the Carnegie soldiers. That was the name of the regiment, was the Carnegie Regiment. And there were about 1,200 of them. And he wanted as many as possible to stay in Canada. And the incentive was that now they was bringing girls over that they could marry. So, and when the soldiers were able to leave the army, they were given enough money for a year to supplies, tools, and land to stay on, and if they did that, then they could find a girl and marry it. Now, the girls in Quebec, the first girls were at the convent, but in 1665, the new intendant came over, and he immediately built a building to house the girls. Whoops. And of course, that's long gone, but it had dormitory space to put the girls that came to Quebec, and also 3 rooms on the bottom floor that were actually halls. We don't know how big they were or anything, but the girls were taken into the halls, and they stood around the perimeter of the walls, like right around here, and then the men were let in, and they walked around past the girls, and if they saw one that they thought they might like, they'd stop and chat with them. It was kind of like speed dating 1660 time. And they'd chat for a while, and if they decided, no, this isn't the right girl for me, or no, I don't want you, then he'd move on to the next one or somewhere down the line. But they just keep circling the room until they probably met somebody that was interested. And there were even notaries there to drop a contract of marriage if they wanted to do that right away. Now, this is still today France. You have to do this. You get a contract first with a notary public, And that can be annulled at any time up until the actual marriage ceremony, church marriage ceremony. So if they decided right then and there that they would sign a marriage contract, they could do that, and then they would actually be engaged more or less, and but they still had time to think about it until the actual marriage date. Now, some of them got married pretty close after that, all within days or a month anyhow. But some of them didn't, waited quite a while before they got married. And in fact, the girl, or either one of them, could annul the marriage at any time until they got married. But once they got married, they were married for life. So this is what the situation was. And I would say almost 1/3 of the girls annulled the contract. Probably not quite that many, but at least 20%. And there was even one case where two couples went to the notarial office, which was downtown Quebec, and got contracts of marriage. And they left, and the next day they came back, and they said, we decided we want to switch. So they switched partners and signed new contracts. And about a third of the girls married these soldiers that were brought over to fight the Iroquois. And so that was a good thing. And they were encouraged by the government, the king, to have many children. And they were given incentives. If they had 10 children, they got a bonus. And if they have 11, they got another bonus. So between what the king gave them and what the soldiers got from remaining in Canada, they had enough to go for a good year. But, some of the girls didn't get married for a year or two, and they became kind of a burden on the community because they had to be taken care of. So, but most of them got married within months of landing. So, and this program lasted for 10 years, and the last year was 1673 was the last group that was sent over. And at that time they decided there's enough girls there now that they can grow the country. And they did. They did. Within 25 years after that first shipload of 36 arrived, their descendants were over 3,000. So that was more than the whole population of Canada. So and of course every year another group came. Some years there were small groups of only 20, and some years there were as many as 120. So, but 726 that we have bios on, that we know were King's daughters. King's daughters was not the name they were given at the time. That happened about 10 years later, and it was Mother Burgess that gave them that name, the Filles du Roi, or daughters of the king, and that name stuck. But so that is the story of how they came, and got married and settled down. And here's a typical new Canadian family. The king's daughter and her soldier husband and their first child of many. Now, there is a book, actually 2 volumes. I thought I had one here. Yeah, here it is. By Peter Gagne, and it's on the King's Daughters and the Founding Mothers. And they're called the Founding Mothers because just about anybody that has French-Canadian descent has one of these, at least one of these girls as their great-great-grandmothers. And in fact, I'm descended from 47 of them. And Peter, the guy that wrote this book, is descended from 83. Because almost everybody is descended from these gals. Without them, they wouldn't have, the British would have taken it over years before. So I'm indebted to them. And if you want to know more, this is a wonderful book. And if you trace your line to any of these girls, there's a bio in here on all of them. There's 2 volumes, and it is by Peter Gagne. And I would advise anybody to read Volume 1, pages 1 to 47, which gives most of the information that I gave you today. We have them in the library here. And it's called King's Daughters and Founding Mothers. Any questions?